Okay, we have a great set of people here, and I feel like 3 minutes passes as good a time to get started as any. I'm Sam Lesson. Thanks for joining our Crypto X Climate Conference, mini conference today. I'm going to give a really quick introduction quickly on kind of what we're going to be doing here today. I want to share a little bit of the agenda and talk a little bit about kind of the big picture thesis of what we're talking about here. And then we're going to dive right into kind of our lightning panels, which is kind of the point. But yeah, I mean, just to kick it off and kind of give people the high level context, what we have here is a group of people today who are super invested in various ways and exploring the idea that the only way we're going to get out of the climate crisis is going to be through crypto. And, it's an interesting thought, right? But if you think about it, I think we can all be, or many of us are super disappointed with the ability of national governments to respond to climate crises globally. And you understand why. I mean, in the end of the day, regional governments were never designed to deal with a truly global crisis the way we face today. It's impossible. And what we face in a lot of ways is with the atmosphere and the climate, a repeat of what happened, in England during the enclosure movement all over again. It's a classic tragedy of the commons. So while we watch kind of governments really heartily struggle to try to make any real progress and coordinate, there's this bigger question, which is there a different toolkit out there that's going to work, right? That's going to help us move the world forward. And it's hard to not think that crypto has a role to play. At the big picture, if you need to coordinate billions, in some cases trillions of dollars of economic activity at the highest, most abstract level, it's hard to miss the fact that crypto is the bottoms-up community approach that makes that happen and can make that happen. So today, the basic point is to explore that idea with a bunch of different really great panels of great people who have thought about this in different ways and in different formats. As with all kind of the slow mini conferences, these are not meant to be hyper formal. They're not super polished. They're not kind of meant to be some big, flashy show. They're more about getting people together to have really interesting conversations super early in the trajectory of things and see if we can all learn something, figure something out, and then ideally kind of meet some other people that are thinking similarly about kind of these early and important spaces. So in terms of what the actual agenda is for the morning, I'm just going to share the preview for a second. So you can see my screen. You should see our table of contents here. Again, I'm going to give a few more quick introductory remarks. We have one special welcome from Glasgow coming. Sep's going to talk about the crypto framework and how to think about money as technology, which is one of my favorite conversations that I've had recently with him. We're going to talk about crypto and agriculture. We're going to talk about DAOs and EV data, which I think is really super cool, what Andy's doing and kind of some of the oracle problems around how do you think about kind of having crypto act in the real world. Regenerative economies, bigger picture, and close. I'll do some quick closing remarks. But again, this is meant to be lightning speed. This is meant to be not boring. Zooms can get super boring, as we all know. And hopefully everyone will come out of this with a few people they've met or are interested in learning more about or a few new ideas. And generally kind of the beginnings of a community coming together that's happening in different pockets already, but in a way that can kind of advance what is a very interesting idea space and honestly a very important one, which I think is as important as anything. Is this one actually really matters? It's not just an intellectual thing. So with that I want to quickly just give one shout out to Renee. Are you here from Glasgow? I think you wanted to dial in and say hey to everyone. A little watching party going on. Hey, there's Renee, allowed to talk. You should be allowed to talk if I know how to do this. Dun, da, 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 ask to unmute.
All right, there we are.
Hey, Sam, what's going on?
Good, so I'm live here from the University of Glasgow campus. I'm in a quiet room. We got a big auditorium next door where people are going to watch the live stream from the mini conference. So super excited for that. Look, I think your opening remarks were spot on. Climate change is real. Governments, institutions so far are failing to address it. And I 100% agree with you that Web3 could actually be the framework, the architecture to meaningfully, work towards a solution. We last month announced the Climate Collective, which is a collaboration of a bunch of really awesome projects in the Web3 space, including actually some of the speakers here, like Virgil from Loam, obviously Sep's involved, that are looking to create sort of, an economy in natural assets such as tokenized rainforest, and have that be the underpinning for digital currencies. And by that means, give kind of an opportunity for letting people not just rely on donations or like, hey, let's plant 1 million trees, but let's really create big substantial demand for these natural assets, and make it an integral part of this digital economy, of this future economy we're working towards. And so lots of great discussions here around this. I'm stoked for all the mini panels and talks. And yeah, it's raining here in Glasgow, so unfortunately not the best weather, but I think people are excited to be here and learn about crypto and Web3.
Awesome. Thanks, Renee. Thanks for dialing in. And it's good to hear people are excited over there as well. Yeah. So again, I think we'll dive right in. Sep, if you can kind of unmute yourself and come up, it'd be great to have you join the stage. But yeah, I'll just say, like, as Sep joins, this is, I think, in a lot of ways, as crypto has evolved, like one of the most interesting promises. And I think you can think a lot about how this interacts with the future of the quote unquote metaverse and things like that, which is the idea that we have all of a sudden a framework for building global economies from scratch and scaling them very, very quickly. That's a really novel new world, especially for those of us, which is all of us, that have grown up in effectively an economic global monoculture. So this composability of economies is fascinating and important. And I couldn't be more excited at the potential that we can point this at what is probably the world's most global and important problem. So with that said, Sep, your video's on. Thanks for joining this morning.
Hey, Sam, how are you?
Okay, you'll be featured automatically. You'd think 2 years into the pandemic, I would know how to use Zoom, but I think this will work. Sep is, I'll just say, one of someone I've known a very long time through many different projects and iterations and ideas, and I think he's one of the deepest thinkers. I always so deeply enjoy talking to you and learning from you and hearing how you're seeing the world. You're obviously also deeply part of the Cello ecosystem, and kind of in terms of what's going on there. So we should talk a little about that. But can you start out just by talking a little bit about how you see and how you think about money as a form of technology? And then kind of from that perspective, like how you think we can think about using the technology of new money, right? Or the technology of these composable economies to start to think about climate in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, for one, let me right back at you. It's always a pleasure to chat. And I mean, for the audience, Sam and I will find so much that we're thinking about the same things. So we seem to be connected in ways other than just like friendship. So yeah, so I mean, basically kind of the blockchain is amazing as a reminder that money is just a technology. Of course, it's always been a technology. It's just that it's hard to remember that it is a technology because its features haven't changed dramatically in the past 300 years. But like any technology, its features can change. And like any widely used technology, its features have a big impact on the societies that use them. And so the question becomes, like, what are the features of money that would make for a more beautiful world, a more prosperous society? I mean, I have some ideas, and I'll talk to 5 of them. But I'll start by framing it by kind of talking about a little story. I was reading this book called The Hidden Life of Trees. And in this book, it talked about mycelial networks. And mycelial networks are amazing. Trees use them to communicate. And there's above ground, we see them as mushrooms, but underground, there's for every square inch of forest, there's thousands of miles of mycelial network. And constantly kind of transporting information, transporting sugars, transporting communication signals. It is remarkable. And when you look at mycelium underneath a microscope, it looks like a nervous system. In fact, it is a nervous system. It is a biological network that is transmitting information and performing computations. And once you see that, it's hard to see anything else the same, because it brings up 2 questions. The first is kind of, in a world where we know that our own intelligence is an emergent property of the neural networks in our brains and hearts and guts. Like, what does that say about the intelligence of a forest, whose neural network is much, much more intricate than those of our brains, basically? And then the second question is, if the forest has a nervous system, what is the organism? Is it the tree or the forest? And I think on the first question, when you think about it deeply enough, you come to the conclusion that the forest has intelligence in ways that we don't fully understand. But ecosystem, so I call that like ecosystem intelligence, basically.
Yeah.
And then on the second question, like when you think about it enough, I come to the conclusion that we are at every level, from cell all the way to Earth, both organism and ecosystem. We are both a whole and a part. And the science fiction writer Arthur Koestler talked about this. He had a word for this, something that is at the same time a whole and a part, and he called it holons. And he argued that everything in the world is a holon. And I actually don't need to know about mycelial networks to kind of feel this truth. Like, I feel like I am a whole, and I feel like I am part of something greater than myself. And as a whole, I have unique purpose. And as a part, I'm connected to all things.
Yeah.
And so kind of I framed the initial question that I had as like, what are the features of money that can make for a more prosperous society, for a more beautiful world? I kind of frame it as, what are the features of money that will foster unique purpose and connectedness of everybody? And so now, I can go to the features.
Yeah, I think you should talk about. So you talk about like there's five fundamentals. I think we should go through those, and then we should kind of dive a little bit into. I mean, again, I think just stepping back for a different perspective, I think you'd agree that in a lot of ways, our financial system and money is a form of a network, right? It is a connection system between us as nodes. It is our backbone of coordination. It was designed in one era with one set of purposes, and that was extremely successful in its era. But the question is, how do we evolve that network, right? Totally. That you ask in crypto, and I think you can particularly ask in climate. But please tell us about the five.
Okay, so the first feature I'd say is a universal basic income that's tied directly into the money system. The second is an idea called demurrage. This was an idea by the economist Silvio Gesell, who he was active in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And he said, whenever there's a recession, people tend to hoard money, and that hoarding of money intensifies the recession. And so he said, well, how do we get out of this trap? And he proposed a small fee on the holding of money. The way he implemented it was he had these dollar bills that you affix a stamp to once a month, and that stamp costs a penny. And so it incentivizes circulation, because if you hold on to it for too long, it just disappears. So that's the second feature. And UBI and demurrage I see as two sides of the same coin. They're like the water cycle. UBI is like rain, and demurrage is like evaporation. UBI ensures universal health. Demurrage ensures non-stagnation. And you can imagine technically how they're related as well. Like one funds the other.
Sure.
So then the third feature is an idea by the philosopher Charles Eisenstein called natural capital-backed currencies. And this is extremely powerful. And he said, historically, whatever has backed money, people tend to make more of. So
shocker.
Exactly. When gold backed money, there was this intense incentive to mine gold, because it's like printing money. In ancient cultures where cattle backed money, people would overproduce cattle. And so he said, why don't we back money with things that we want to see more of in the world, like pristine forests or clean rivers? And that's a powerful idea. And so that's the third feature, called natural capital-backed currencies. The fourth feature, I'll put it under the umbrella of community currencies. And basically, I remember when the internet was first coming out, people were like, whoa, like you can imagine putting the whole encyclopedia on the internet. And this was true, and an internet native encyclopedia is more powerful, more up to date, more accessible than a regular encyclopedia. But it fundamentally underestimated the true potentiality of the internet, because the encyclopedia would be one part of a much richer information ecology. And similarly, when Bitcoin was first coming out, people were like, whoa, like you could imagine this replacing fiat. And given that history, I was like, no, like Bitcoin will be big and powerful, and fiat will come on chain and be more powerful. And both of them will be parts of a much larger ecology of value that includes local currencies, regional currencies, functional currencies, all interoperating. And then the fifth feature is a feature called, is the creation of money in a way that's not concomitant with the creation of new debt. So all money right now is created through interest-bearing debt. As a consequence, there's always more debt than there is money. We can never pay off our loans. And I say at the beginning of the industrial age, this was a feature, not a bug.
Absolutely.
It impelled growth. The growth has been good for us. We've grown our way out of a lot of our problems. But now that we're reaching the carrying capacity of the earth, it's not clear that we can grow our way out of our problems. And I can imagine a lot of ways to bring money into the world. I can imagine gifting money into existence. I can imagine UBIing money into existence. I can imagine people earning money into existence, for example, by planting trees, basically. You could imagine a scenario in which people earn money into existence by planting trees, and the whole rest of the financial infrastructure can stay the same. Like banks can still create money, make loans, but in order to do so, they have to employ large numbers of people to reforest our global forests. And so anyway, those are the 5 features. And what's extremely exciting about crypto is it gives the potentiality to implement those features into our modern mediums of exchange.
Well, and I think with the other thing, Steph, I'd call, I mean, like just to kind of pull out for a second, tell me if you feel this way. It's like, look, the demurrage concept and UBI, I agree they go hand in hand, and they can have really important potential futures. I actually think of UBI more as the ability to like let more people take more risk, right? Is almost the way I see it, which I think would be a great equalizer, because that risk capacity is the biggest thing. That can have an impact on the climate world, but I think is tangential, right? Then there's the question of like, well, what's your base asset, right? Like, what's the thing you're based on? Is it debt, right? Which is effectively, borrowing against future growth in the current economy, right? Saying like, okay, like which is great. I mean, that actually compels the future to exist, because you're basically getting people to commit to create a certain future, right? And then you're lending them against it, and then they are compelled to actually make that future, right? And it almost is like, it's kind of like putting a treadmill in front of people in a healthy way, ideally, in an ideal form. But we can agree that the version of that for creating more washing machines is going to quickly run out, right? And is also damaging, has some serious externality problems. So the question for me almost is like, let's pretend that we wanted to put out there climate neutrality, right? Or carbon removal as kind of that thing in the future that you build an economy around, right? And you get people to buy into, and then kind of build it. I think what's really interesting about crypto is that it would be nearly impossible to imagine a world where national governments could pivot around that fast enough. Like their entire infrastructure is built around the existing economic system.
Yep.
Crypto all of a sudden gives this composability where like you can just do it, I can just do it, and it can, the rules of social networking and the internet is it can grow fast enough and be impactful enough, especially with financial leverage, that you can move trillions of dollars, actually in a lot of cases potentially much faster than governments can, right? Yeah. So the question in my mind is like, one, do you think that's like a fair way to think about this? And then two, like what actually has to happen, right, to get that flywheel spinning from your perspective?
Yeah, these are great questions. So I totally agree. And one way I frame that is basically kind of, one can think about money as a social agreement. And one can see it most easily in the context of IOUs, basically. Like if I give you an IOU and other people to choose to accept that IOU, I have just created money. And the social agreement is that if you give it to me, I will give you something in return for it, basically. And other people choosing to accept it is an agreement that they will take this as money. In fiat monies, basically kind of the social agreement is a joint agreement around monetary policy. Like this is how we create our money. And it's interesting because debates about monetary policy are both extremely intense and also like within like a really narrow range.
Yeah.
And that is because it's because money is a monopoly right now. And so because money is a monopoly, it affects everyone. And so because it affects everyone, basically kind of you can't explore ideas outside of a narrow range because it's too risky. And it affects, because if it affects everyone, the conversations are intense. But once you have the ability to have lots of different medium of exchange and people opting into medium of exchange, all of a sudden you can explore whole ranges of monetary policy, social agreement, and the social agreements that lead to those monetary policy.
Yep.
So for example, you can have a community currency that is backed by a rainforest in Brazil, basically, you know? And so in Celo, we've done a lot of thinking about this, and we've designed both the layer one and also the community of stable assets in order to be able to adopt these things. So the way that Celo dollars works, for example, is that the more it follows the price of Celo dollars as compared to the US dollar. If it's above a US dollar, that means the demand is too strong and it prints more and sells it on the open market in exchange for reserve assets that it then puts in a reserve. And if the demand is too low, if the price is lower than $1, that means that the supply is too much. The protocol automatically buys up Celo dollars in exchange for reserve assets and retires them. In the reserve, if we have a target, we could imagine, and we're working towards, having a target allocation of 40% of the reserve towards things like tokenized rainforests. If we do that, the more Celo dollars in circulation, the bigger the reserve gets. The bigger the reserve gets, the bigger that 40% gets. The bigger that 40% gets, the more rainforest is algorithm, like protocol centric, protected by the reserve.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So I think let me ask you. I mean, like, that makes sense, but just to push, I think it's so interesting to me. Like I always say, like there's these periods when rainforests burn. My thinking has always been, man, if people were getting paid for those rainforests, they would not be burning, right? Right, like no question. Like this is, you want to stop the rainforest from burn, figure out how to like how effectively privatize or tokenize and like distribute value of it not burning, right? It will stop burning very quickly. But I guess the question for me is there's a difference between treating some of these assets as like, or as charity or a byproduct versus saying like, this is a fundamental driver of the economic system, right? And so I'm kind of curious, like, if you see a space there or how you think about it, like, how you think about evolving it in a way and things in a way where like the climate initiatives, there's a lot of projects that kind of have an allocation towards climate, right? In some way, shape or form, but instead we're like, it's not like a charitable thing, right? It like literally is the core economic driver. Because I think that's how you move like trillions of dollars, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it has to be central. And so kind of the reason why I brought that piece up, there's a lot of different pieces, but the reason why I brought that piece up is that aligns economic growth with ecological regeneration. So the more the economy grows, the more money goes into circulation, the more the rainforests are naturally preserved. And I'm using that as shorthand. I mean, we will want to do that with multiple different ecosystems. The oceans are important, air quality is important, and so on.
Great.
But that's one of the fundamental pieces. I think the other thing that crypto can do is it can take some of the work that is being done externally. Like, for example, the work being done both in the voluntary and regulated markets around carbon credits is really useful. The carbon markets are pretty opaque right now. They're pretty, they're pretty kind of siloed right now. and doing things like putting them on chain, making it clear that like when a carbon credit is burned on chain, that means it can't be double spent. All of these things yield a whole range of financial tools that are useful in the context of natural capital-backed currencies, but also absent that context, in the context of kind of like forward purchase of carbon and so on, all of these things that are useful for environmental protection.
And that's I mean, you and I could talk for ages on this. So I think, I think we should, but I appreciate you doing it a lot. I think this might be a good thing to quickly end on, which is, I mean, when I talk to people in the government, right, about anything that touches like crypto and climate, what they will say is bullshit, consumer-driven carbon markets have never worked, they'll never work, da, 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 da. In my head, I've always thought to myself, wait a minute, I don't think the government ones are working either, right? So I'm not exactly sure, what the point is, and clearly we need something new. I mean, talk to me a little bit how central do you think governments are even going to have to be, like in kind of an idealized world? Like obviously the startup community, and on my view, at least my theory would be the startup community is going to have to start this, right? And going to have to make it work end to end. The governments aren't going to play for a while, but do you think the governments ever have to come online to kind of envision some of these things, or do you think they can truly be run in like a multiverse parallel way with different economies at scale?
Yeah, that is a fantastic question. What I'll point to, so what I'll say to that is I think it's extremely useful to have lots like to have an environment in which lots of progress can be made even before central governments step in, basically. There was this wonderful, I forget where I read this, but it was following some of the big Supreme Court decisions around social change, things like the right for women to vote, as one example. And basically kind of in all of these landmark changes, basically what happened is it started with one state making a law. And really kind of that was driven by like, really, it was really local. It was like a couple cities in that state. Then a couple more states did it. Then a few more states did it. And at a certain point, like when around half the states did it, then exactly. And so that's shaped my kind of point of view around how social change happens. It happens bottom up until it can happen top down.
That makes a lot of sense. I think that's a great analogy. I think the era of, the states being the labs of democracy, right, is long over because our world has become too big and too interconnected, right? And so I think that's another reason, if you want to be excited about crypto and its importance and potential, is in some ways it is our ability to once again create labs, right?
Absolutely.
For different
and you see
economic
this across
systems.
the board in governance, in community norms, in all of these things, like the crypto communities are serving as really interesting labs.
Great, cool. Victor, I'm gonna have to move on, but Sep, here's a good question for you and everyone you should check out, and we can keep going, maybe follow up from there. Thank you for your time this morning. And again, I really appreciate, you kind of always giving the big picture framing here on these really cool and important issues. With that, I want to invite up Virju. I see your camera's on. Hey, thanks for joining. Sep, thanks for joining.
Great to chat. And hey, Virju.
Hey, Sep.
It's a small world. Northwestern Kellogg, you're repping there pretty hard.
I did not go to Kellogg, but I have a nice curated background for you.
That's pretty funny. Cool. Well, look, it's great to have you up. Thanks for joining this morning. We're going to talk agriculture. And how does crypto and incentivizing behavior change now agriculture? We all know that obviously agriculture is one of the huge contributors to climate, both from a deforestation perspective, as well as, right, all sorts of other kind of everything down to cows farting, right? So I would love to kind of, you have a deep agricultural background, obviously, and are pretty deep on the crypto side too. I want to get into it, but do you want to start a little bit kind of giving your kind of lay of the land from an agriculture perspective and like how you kind of see crypto can play a role in the abstract?
Yeah, agriculture is huge. So I'm going to talk about the broad agriculture and then narrow it, right? Agriculture means farming cows for meat, farming corn and soy for everything, for food, for feeding those cows, for ethanol. There's fish farming for fishing for tuna. there's rainforest farming. So agriculture, actually, I think people usually think of the farm that they see as like, oh, that's agriculture. It's actually a gigantic industry, right? It's like number two related to health, which is number one. So hugely gigantic landscape. I think, and Sam, you and I were talking about this last week, agriculture in all aspects was driven by these subsidies that were created by governments hundreds of years ago, right? So the corn and soy subsidies created by the US government really built this gigantic industry around, let's just farm as much corn and soy as we can. Let's build these big machines for these 540 acre fields that are able to farm these corn and soy machines. These gigantic machines weigh over, potentially 16 tons. They compact the soil. And then they cause farmers to have to do tillage to release carbon because they soil compact every year. So these large subsidies that have existed for a couple hundred years, they did not take into account anything related to greenhouse gas emissions, or did not take anything into account related to the climate. And we built this massive economy off them. John Deere, Monsanto, why they exist is because of these subsidies, and why they exist in the way that they are is because of these subsidies. And so, just kind of broadening agriculture, it's a huge space. It's the number two economy in terms of food outside of healthcare. It's driven by these government subsidies that have existed for hundreds of years. And now when you translate that to crypto, we're talking about the movement, right? I mean, so you're talking about government subsidies that have existed without change in large bureaucracies, and they're very moved to slow for something that's needed immediately. But even though it's needed immediately, we have to track it for a long time because you don't see the change with your visible eye, right? Yeah. And so, as Loam, we're launching a company, Loam, and Loam is really about incentivizing behavior change for farmers. We're starting off with the largest agriculture industry, corn and soy farming, which is the largest in the world. And we're incentivizing farmers to change their behavior, to think of not only as their crop, as their cash crop, but also think of carbon as another form of that cash crop. And so that's something that, in all honesty, a lot of farmers actually believe in climate change. You'll be surprised. I think people think that they're more right-wing supporting, not believing in climate. That's actually not true. They understand their land very well. And they actually view carbon as actually like a necessary deposit back into Mother Earth. They've been kind of just withdrawing from Mother Earth's land in her bank, withdrawing carbon they haven't deposited in. So hopefully that gives kind of a landscape there.
Yeah, so let's dive into a few specific things I think would be interesting to touch on. I mean, the first is I think it's fascinating, right, to understand that even kind of the machinery that are used on farms that is completely economically driven and legally driven. Like it's someone's random stroke of the pen, right? Yeah. In certain cases, they cause like exactly the formation of the industry. I mean, that intellectually makes sense to me, but it's amazing the depth of it. Yep. What it basically means to me is like, unsurprisingly, farmers are ridiculously economically rational, right? Yep. As actors. Yep. To get them to start caring about the environment and specifically carbon markets, like there's a few steps. One is they're obviously like, you need to get really good at validating what they're actually doing, right? Yep. Because if you can't validate it, you can't prove it, you can't really do much of anything, right? Like, so there's like an oracle problem effectively. Then there's the problem. So let's pretend you could do that and you could issue out, credits in a fair way, or like chips in a fair way for doing positive things for the for climate. That's part one. Second is you have to have demand for it from somewhere, right? And so I guess the question is like, one, are those the two right big picture problems to think about? And then two, how do you solve both? Because you don't really get anywhere unless you've solved both.
That's fair. So I'll be the first to admit I'm definitely an expert more at the supply side and the supply data side. I think the demand side I'll be actually interested in hearing from the people attending this. But we can try to talk about that. There's a couple things going on right now and over the last like literally 3 years of why the timing's right now. A lot of the farms, if you think of healthcare has always had diagnostics, X-ray machines, blood tests, etc. Farming diagnostics were really a person looking at a farmer's almanac, or an agronomist like looking at the field with their eye and saying, here's your problems. And now that's really been digitized, over the last 3 years. And so what I mean by that is you could look at the layers of farmland. You could look at soil samples. You could look at how much nitrogen has been sprayed off of machine data. You could look at like satellite infrared maps and thermal maps. And you start getting this layered cake of data that is all now in various APIs of various companies that you could pull together that are aggregated, create that layer cake and understand what's really going on the farm. So the one thing is diagnostics for farms have really increased. That data is now clean and layered up together. And now we could actually measure things from it. So I think that's one gigantic thing about bringing farm data online. And the second thing what's interesting is farmers are extremely frustrated because a lot of their data is owned by these gigantic OEMs. So Monsanto will own their data, or John Deere will own their data. And all farmers, you ask them, all of them, they believe that they should own the data. They're farming the field, right? So the second thing is that they've always wanted to, in the last.
They should talk to the Facebook people. I'm kidding.
Yeah, they should. Yeah, they should. That's right.
There's only one story in the world.
Every farmer wants to build their own farmer meta farm bill. But the third thing is that besides owning the data and now that data being readily available in the cloud, is that most farmers, people don't realize they rent land. Over 60% of farmers rent land. They don't own the land. So what that means is that they don't own an asset that appreciates over time in land. So they're farming every year for as much yield as possible to get their cash, right? They have to afford their lives every year. And so they still want an asset that grows with them in value. And that actually is data. Farmland's kind of the ultimate NFT in that case. And then the last thing, the commodity markets have changed significantly. So consumer behavior, consumer demand, on the last side of what you said, Sam, it's all about organic. And
yeah,
organic is not a lot of people think organic is a fallacy. Organic's real, right? 0.6% of organic of farmland is organic, not much. But what organic means is you're not spraying chemicals. You're most likely planting cover crops. You're most likely not doing tillage. Some cases you are doing tillage. And you're treating the land like you would treat your body if you're on like an awesome diet, right? And so those four things are really, they come to a head now in ag, where crypto actually makes a lot of sense. Where if you think of farmland as an NFT and you think about the data from an Oracle standpoint, and then you actually think about the demand side, wanting to incentivize more organic farmland because you and I want more organic food or organic milk, it's all coming together right now.
Yeah, makes sense. So let's talk about this John Deere thing. This is fascinating. So your basic theory is we have this Oracle problem, right? In general, with a lot of climate cryptos and stuff. How do we know what trees are planted, blah, blah, blah. We all know this is a huge fucking problem, candidly, right? Your assertion is that actually we don't have this problem in farming, really. John Deere knows exactly what's going on, right? The problem is who owns that data, who gets paid for that data, right? And basically how do you unlock it in a way that's going to allow the right incentivization, right, broadly in the market? Is that basically the answer?
It's spot on. I think if all of you could go visit your nearest corn farmer and go visit your nearest corn farmer that owns maybe over a couple hundred acres, and ask them for their yield map, their planting map, their nitrogen map, their phosphorus map, their potassium map. They have all of it. They have it all by a centimeter level. And what that means is that they've measured everything that they possibly could for their farm field. And because they've measured everything, we can now algorithmically tell, the chemical runoff, the disease that's going on in the farm. And we can also tell the carbon map. And so it still needs a little work, don't get me wrong, but we could actually now build, instead of planting maps and yield maps, we can build a carbon map for a farm year over year.
Is there a future? And again, I don't want to go only on this, but I'm just so fascinated by this. Is there a future in your mind where John Deere's business is, I'll be a little bit silly about this. You give away the tractors, right? You collect the data, and then you get a VIG effectively from the farmers on validating their carbon activities effectively, right? And so maybe and you kind of split the credits with them in some way, shape, or form.
It's happening. So there's this company, Adena Farms, that's backed by the Canada Pension Fund, the Teachers Pension Fund in Canada. They're a model farm in Nebraska, and what they're doing is that they're basically doing farming as a service. They're not charging anything. They're doing all your services. They're doing your planting, your spraying, all that stuff. But they're doing it in a very regenerative agriculture way, in a sustainable way. And all they're doing is making money on the credits, or trying to make money on the credits plus other subsidies. In farming, there's actually a lot of subsidies going on about not doing chemicals so you don't erode land. Also voluntary carbon credits that exist, and moving from GMO to non-GMO. So they're trying to basically farm for free to get these subsidies and split it with everybody. So there are some kind of model players and model farms doing this. But I see that as the new world. In my idealistic sense, right? I mean, it's
and so in that way, I mean, let's just kind of play this out. This is a very crypto native audience here. Is the way to think about the future of John Deere that John Deere is effectively a validator?
I get this. I use the term certifier and validator. To me, this is a data science problem. It's farms, we have data. There's still a lot of work to rasterize that data into a pixel, right? And all the layers of data. So you just have to clean it to be very accurate on like a per square foot level to see what carbon is sequestered and what's not. But in my mind, John Deere is just another version of a data input into the Oracle. And potentially they also have a lot of people that know agriculture for a lot of years that could certify a farm's field and saying that this person is actually sequestering this much carbon, right? And then, to tie it back to what we said before, when you like, there's two ways to really get carbon, right? You either plant something or you do something to the soil itself, right? And so you trap it. Now in farming, and what we don't really talk about is the hard problem is when you sequester 1 ton of carbon per acre, you can't till that land for 100 years. Otherwise you don't get the benefit, right? And so a lot of times people think this is a year-to-year problem. It's not. It's a longer-term problem. So you need to be bought in to these practices. Now, don't get me wrong. Like if I
It's like burning. It's
Yeah,
burning. You
it's
got to
burning.
burn land, basically,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
From like a crypto perspective.
You got to burn land from a crypto perspective. The analogies are crazy. It's so true. Yeah, no. So
Well,
I do imagine. I do imagine John Deere will. I know they're looking at it, and I know a lot of the OEMs are looking at it. Is how do we incentivize cover crop adoption, and potentially they pay less for a machine or pay less for our inputs in order to do it, and we can make money on the back end with credits.
Yeah. I mean, that is a fascinating future. And I think it's a very interesting thing to think about, especially at our next panel with Andy. I'm sure we'll get into this. Is some similar ideas around consumer side stuff.
Yeah, that's
interesting.
right.
Okay, so your view is, I mean, in some ways, I'd argue this is an optimistic view, right? Of kind of the future and kind of where we go with carbon, which is we still have the big crazy question mark in the room, which is how do you get people the demand to go for these credits, especially bottoms up, right? The traditional answer is just like any tax, like the demand for dollars comes because you have to have dollars to pay your taxes. The demand for carbon credits will come because you have to have carbon credits to pay the government, right? In some way, shape, or form. But if that's off the table, because none of us control governments, and I wouldn't expect governments to be able to move on this type of stuff, really, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Then the question becomes: there's a kind of this thing of, do you think, do consumers demand that companies be carbon neutral or in a provable way, and therefore they do it almost as a marketing campaign? Does that marketing campaign then create a financial world where these credits are actually valuable enough that people start speculating on them, right? And then does that in its like build up enough momentum that you can move trillions of dollars in and maybe eventually get government adoption? I do wonder, I want to talk one more second about this from an agriculture perspective. Like, what do you think, how far out do you think we are? Or do you think that on the flip side, consumers can pressure agriculture directly, or do you think it has to go through a more general framework, right? Because again, because farming is such a huge source of the problem.
Yeah, it's unfortunately and fortunately, right? Like you have to follow the food supply chain here. So like, let's talk about the US food supply chain. McDonald's, right? That's the most gigantic consumption of food. McDonald's gets most of their ingredients from US Foods, the most gigantic food distributor. They buy from co-ops. So let's say Iowa Farmers Association, they're buying all their corn and then that's going to the farmer. Similar to Trader Joe's, right? Trader Joe's, let's say they decide to put a carbon stamp on all their products, and I've had conversations with them on that. They're verticalized. So they don't go to US Foods, they go to their Trader Foods distributor that then goes to their farms itself, right? So you actually have to play into that ecosystem as your first step in terms of collecting data and doing that traceability. But on the demand side of it, what's interesting is that you do have Trader Joe's making strategic decisions like this starting now. You do have US Foods repricing their products based on consumers wanting organic and carbon sensitive food. And so they're already repricing products for McDonald's in this way. And then you have McDonald's thinking about, hey, if I sell a cheeseburger, what if I add a couple pennies to it because this is a carbon sustainable cheeseburger, right? And this is the same concept of like, if you buy a United flight, you can offset your flight with a carbon credit.
Well, but here, can I ask you a crazy question?
Yeah.
I'm kind of curious what you think of this. It's just spitballing with you for a second, because that's the nice part of having mini unconferences, right? Here's my spitball. I can totally believe the marketing math, especially with new generations, that says, hey, it's actually worth the few cents in the extra cheeseburger cost or whatever, because frankly, on the margin, one extra person buys it because this is an important issue, and therefore the economics of us just doing this makes sense. I buy that. But how about this? What if McDonald's said, you're going to get a wallet, right? We'll give you the carbon credit, right? Like we'll give it to you. right?
Yeah.
And you make it a retail speculation thing where basically you allow consumers to say, the reason I'm going to go eat a McDonald's burger versus not is because not only do I get the burger, but I also get effectively the carbon credit, right?
Yeah.
And there's a market for that and a speculation around that as crypto becomes one. Is that too wild? Or is that
That's
like,
cool.
are there interesting models in there? Because
I mean, what's funny,
I wonder if, yeah.
I've never heard that. And what's funny about that, like immediately my head goes to you're disrupting this whole loyalty ecosystem that exists.
Totally.
And like instead of McDonald's giving you loyalty because you're eating cheeseburgers so you can get fatter and just eat more cheeseburgers, their loyalty is actually tied to something of a bigger mission. That's actually really interesting.
Well, it's partially loyalty, but it's also, I mean, that's still a marketing angle from my perspective. I think it's just like straight economics, which is like, if would people buy carbon credits not as some sort of like virtue signaling thing, but actually as an economically rational decision in a world of YOLO economies, right?
Yeah.
Would I want the 10 cents of McDonald's cheeseburger offset, right, that I bought along with my burger? Because, right, like, you know, I watch things go YOLO to 10,000x, right?
Yeah.
And therefore it actually becomes not a way to expose consumers, just as John Deere all of a sudden becomes a validator on that end. Like McDonald's is the consumer side of that. Like, is that a possible future, or am
For sure. I mean, like the analogy I'll give you is like when organic milk came out, I remember that all these health studies came out with organic milk when you had a new baby. So then people started justifying $8 per gallon versus $2 per gallon. And in their head, buying $8 per gallon of milk every week for your kid up until they're age 5, they had this like equation in their head economically that's like, this is going to help my kid like live longer, right? And it's kind of the similar sense from a carbon standpoint, right? Like we have to start giving that narrative of that economic value of like, you know, that couple cents of a carbon credit is going to help your kid live on this planet longer type thing, right? Or their kid, right? And I think that has a multiple or a P multiple to it. And I think that more of the community that we can get around and more of the demand we can get around it starts generating that multiple over a horizon that's no longer 7 years, but hundreds of years. And I think that's what's interesting. That's super interesting.
It's always fun. Look, it's always great bullshitting with you. Thank you for giving us a little bit of the read into the kind of what's going on the agricultural side. And again, I think one of the most interesting things for me, and maybe, you know, the participants already know this, people watching this, is in my mind, the Oracle problem is like probably the Oracle and demand. Those are the two problems. And in my mind, the farming Oracle problem is an extremely intense one. It's cool to hear from you that while maybe they are hyper centralized and not the ideal, you know, crypto native version of decentralized validation of everything, that like we do have trustable data streams, at least for some of the stuff already. Very cool.
Awesome.
Cool. Thanks, man. All right.
Bye.
I'm going to invite up my partner Clay at Slow to kind of to manage our next panel, and I'll be back with you. But Clay, thank you for calling in from Europe. What time is it where you're at?
It's around 7, so not too late.
Not too late yet, but before you go out to all the Lisbon parties.
yeah, exactly. All of the crypto happenings.
Stay safe out there. I may have gotten our venture firm canceled this morning on Twitter, so Clay's got to be safe in the crypto community today.
Yeah, I'll greet you with a bom dia, which, you know, in Portuguese is good morning. So thanks for that. I may need some protection.
Clay, take it away, man.
Yeah, no, thanks. And I'm purely here to introduce our next panelist, Andy Chatham, who's co-founder of Demo. And I'm not going to give too much up around what he's building in and around the intersection of AVs, EVs, and open data networks, because I know that he has some materials planned here, but we'll get into a discussion right after. So Andy, if you want to take over and share what you have prepped, would be great, and then we can get into the discussion.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Andy. I've spent about 10 years in the mobility world, and the last 4 or 5 years I've been focused specifically on scaling fleets of autonomous vehicles. I started a company called Demo about 1.5 years ago with a partner, and we are in the process of launching it out into the real world. There's some interesting stuff that you might be able to see up on our site today, demo.zone. I'm happy to take you through kind of a quick super high level demo of what we're building and why we think it matters in the world of crypto and particularly how it's relevant for the climate conversation. And Clay, I'll kind of use you as a proxy if you want to cut me off or jump in with any questions. I'm also happy to take questions as they come in. And I'll share a few slides because I think that'll be helpful helpful in kind of setting the context on what we're building, and yeah, we can take it from there. Sound good?
Sounds good.
All right. Let's see. All right, y'all should have my whole screen here. A little terrifying, but there we go. So yeah, DEMO is an acronym. It stands for Digital Infrastructure for Moving Objects. Our goal is to move people around more effectively with technology. We're building a decentralized connectivity platform for electric and automated vehicles. I'll explain a little bit of what that means. I also put some stuff together specific to this conversation. We're trying to take the future from this cyberpunk type of aesthetic into something that I've heard thrown around quite a bit recently, which is solar punk. We take a really positive view on the potential futures that we could be moving into, and we think what we're building has a large potential to impact that. One of the biggest problems we're seeing, oops, let me get rid of this Zoom thing here. So we looked at the world which we know on our team, which is that of the transportation and mobility world, and we see a lot of huge changes happening. I lived through the first kind of major shift, which was sort of like circuit switching trips to packet switching trips, everything being digitized, put on networks like Uber and Lyft. And now we're seeing kind of the second and third major shifts happen basically at the same time, which is electric vehicles being adopted at scale and autonomous vehicles coming shortly behind them. We're sitting right here, as many of you know, in terms of battery demand, and supply is rapidly ramping to catch up with that. And we're starting to see some of the early massive problems with the space. We think there's likely to be kind of a corresponding number of issues that happen as the number of batteries also increases in supply, and we think ultimately this is a big data problem, right? Like there's a very limited supply of information about how batteries are performing out in the real world. We also see that with autonomous driving systems and kind of like the network level optimization in mobility, and we think without better data for consumers and enterprises, it's just not going to be possible to build a zero emission, zero fatality mobility future. And I was doing a little bit of writing over the weekend. We're preparing a white paper, as some of these new crypto projects tend to do. And I came up with this quote, which I actually remembered from my college days, where you need to have three things in order to effectively govern some sort of common resource or asset, an institution of rules, a credible commitment to follow them, and collective monitoring. And I was turned on to this by Jesse Walden, who's a really good writer and thinker in the space. And he pointed out that crypto networks have really figured out a way to control for a lot of these issues and effectively create community governed computer networks, which is something that we're taking and we're applying to mobility networks as well. So obviously, if your code is open source, and you can make programmatic rules, that solves number one. One of the really interesting things, which we can get into a little bit more, is credible commitments. And obviously one of the big topics in the crypto climate discussion is how proof of work is a really good solution for that. And we think we're about to see some really interesting major networks like Ethereum shift to proof of stake. And then the collective monitoring piece of it is something that we think quite a bit about at DEMO as well. And we're building primitives to basically verify that something happened in the real world using these existing trust chains that might be established by an automaker or a transit agency or a battery manufacturer, and basically being able to create these kind of proof of movement primitives is something that we think is going to be super important for scaling up a lot of these Web3 networks that move into the real world. So just to kind of like make this a little bit more tangible, what is DEMO? We're building a platform where people can collect data from their vehicles. We're focusing specifically on electric vehicles. People collect data from their cars using either hardware or software connections, sometimes both, and they provide them to at first, very centralized platform, over time, more decentralized, and they're rewarded in a token that we provide them. We are building a developer platform and what we call enterprise services, which is where we aggregate the data, anonymize it, and share it with folks that can turn it into either useful insights for an enterprise, like how is this battery performing out in the real world, or some useful application, like can I get a better rate on my car insurance, or can you send me an email if my tire is flat or my battery is about to run out of charge? So we've kind of taken this connected vehicle paradigm that's being established, and we've built a more decentralized and kind of credibly neutral platform in the middle. And we're incorporating lots of different stakeholders into this world. Obviously, we have a plan to incorporate not just hardware and dongle OEMs, but the vehicle makers themselves, data providers. I think a lot of people are starting to become aware of user-owned networks like Helium and some of these other kind of Web3 IoT models that are starting to take hold. And we're certainly building on a lot of work that's been set out there. And then, obviously app developers and data consumers are folks that we're building this for. So I'm happy to kind of take a pause there, Clay, and see if you want to kind of dive in. The next thing I was going to talk about was how we create demand signal and incentives within this world. And I think that's kind of one of the pieces that Sam was also touching on in the previous conversation. So happy to jump in there.
Yeah. So I think that we can get to that. For me, selfishly, I think it'd be great to just kind of zoom out and in the abstract, sort of what you've covered here and what we know about what you're building at Demos is really a credibly neutral data platform, right? And with every open data platform that's created, you hope and dream of them contributing to meaningful progression in the context of environmental change. So it'd be great if you could talk a little bit about how you envision sort of these open data networks, broadly speaking, whether in the context of Demo or in the climate tech sense, more abstractly. Like what are the things that they do in terms of achieving the vision of actually driving for the right incentive mechanisms?
So I think there's kind of a unique opportunity with this new model to supercharge some of the behaviors that people established in the previous iteration. So like I lived through Uber and Lyft scaling up. I worked for a company called Transdev for 7 years, which is a large public transit system operator. And they also had a significant taxi and on-demand transportation business in the US, which was rapidly devalued by Uber and Lyft. And we saw the incentives they were able to create for drivers to join this platform and tap into this whole new sort of supply in the mobility system that just didn't exist before. And they were able to do that with this incentive model that included just basically paying people more than it was worth and raising a bunch of money to do that. And there were kind of some unique macro conditions that created that. But what you're seeing now is, that model is sort of like returning back to equilibrium, and we're basically winding up with Uber and Lyft as a replacement for taxi companies. It was kind of a bait and switch. And what we see with the crypto world is the opportunity to kind of fix. I'll put this other slide up here because this is something I found from Jesse as well. To sort of fix the platform's relationship to a user base over time. Like everybody has seen a platform that is great at the beginning. It attracts lots of users, tons of benefit for joining at the early days, and then it becomes really exploitative over time. And we think there's a much better model that we're building on for Demo, and a lot of good examples where if you pay somebody in a token and they hold that over time, their incentives are long-term aligned with you, and it's much easier to do that from a regulatory and just a practical standpoint today. And it's a much healthier way to build a business. So like from day one, we thought about building this EV data sharing platform, and we tried to go out and buy data from some of these centralized aggregators, and it just felt like if you're going to start a new venture today, it is almost a no-brainer in at least our world, especially given what we saw with the rapid growth of the Helium network and some of the others out there. Like it just makes sense to start from that place today. And I think you're going to see a lot of businesses backtracking to put that into their model. And then basically every new company that succeeds in the next 3 to 5 years, one prediction I might make is that they have some sort of crypto incentive baked in, or some token model that they can at least plug into. And we're seeing a lot of really positive response in some of our partnership conversations today, as far as like being able to not just like check that box, but really appeal to folks that are going to provide services in our ecosystem that we're building.
Got it. Yeah, and just to push on one of those things that we haven't actually talked about much in our conversations is the existing incumbents and their ability to sort of refactor some of their operations to Web3. Do you view Demo and other implementations like this as a path for them to participate in terms of having a credibly neutral layer in the context of their products and services?
So one thing that's really interesting about the mobility world, and I think it's sort of the same for telecom, although telecom's a little bit more centralized, is like, but transportation and mobility is already quite decentralized. And especially at the policy level, like we have 50 different state DOTs. They all sit over 20, so sometimes way more, local DOTs, transit agencies, folks that are kind of like involved in the decision-making process. And I think the Web3 world, when the tooling and the kind of like governance framework catches up to what the user experience expectations are from modern software platforms, like I think that's going to be really interesting to see that interplay start to happen. And I think there's quite a bit that is yet to be discovered in that design space. And then on the auto OEM side of things, and kind of like the existing established players, there's not a whole lot that they have to do in order to opt into something like this. It's not like you're asking them to totally re-platform a new vehicle that they're making. In a lot of cases, the next generation vehicle platforms are going to have secure elements and the ability to run sort of arbitrary code on the car, which is something that's sort of terrifying, but also like opens up the door to saying, hey, let's put an Ethereum wallet in this car and have it sign all the data before it sends it up to the cloud. And that's what we're doing with our dongle that's plugging into the cars. And the next generation of cars, it's basically an opt-in for an OEM to go to their tier 1 supplier and say, hey, put the secure element on the vehicle because it's something that customers are asking us for, and it helps them offset the cost of their vehicle. It helps us verify the data that's coming off of the vehicle to make sure that it's correct. And we think there's kind of like a really great way to sort of shoehorn a lot of these Web3 networks into existing business models that are out there. And in a lot of cases, it helps, a company like Ford or GM or, Stellantis in the auto world, like really kind of draw the line between them and a lot of the sort of Web2 tech platforms like, Amazon, which is in, the new Jeep that's pre-plumbed with Alexa, which, I think some people might like, but other people might be like, this is creepy and I don't want it. So it gives them the ability to sort of draw the line and say, hey, the users are actually in control of everything on this side. And it's credibly neutral because it's based on this thing that has existed for now over a decade. And you can run your own software on it. And we're about to be in that world. I think it's not too far off.
Yeah. And so Sam and Burju touched on the problem of oracles in the context of agriculture, and through the connected dongle that you have, that's sort of one gateway to help to verify some of the data that's being piped over. But can you talk through tactically, like within mobility, what are the ways in which you can actually verify that the data that you're capturing is really the data that should be incentivized rather than something that's being spoofed, and how sort of the mechanics that you're delivering through demo incentives help to mitigate some of those risks of sort of the Sybil attack, if you will, on the network.
Yeah. So this is something that we learned a ton about through operating Helium networks, and basically this whole project with Demo. I feel like I'm probably not giving enough context on Demo itself, but it will all become clear in a week or two if you follow along with us. So we saw a lot of spoofing happening early on in the Helium community, and that was something they had to organize around and solve. And ultimately, kind of like whenever you see these sort of denial of service attacks happen to a crypto network, or somebody figure out how to exploit a smart contract, like the cool thing about a lot of these Web3 networks is that they're anti-fragile to these types of attacks, right? So it makes them stronger and better ultimately, as long as it doesn't sort of kill them initially, which has happened occasionally. One thing that is an example of the kind of composability behind how these networks are going to start to interact with each other. This I pulled in to the slide deck here, and that shows somebody actually verifying coverage on the Helium network as they're driving around and pinging all of the different Helium radios that are out there. So once we integrate that into our dongle and some of the vehicles that are running on the network, you'd be able to not just use Demo and the OEM's API and our hardware to kind of triangulate and make sure you're getting real data, but also measure it against another network. So in order to fake something, you would have had to go out and like hack Helium and send fake data to Helium, and also send fake data to the OEM's API, and also send fake data to the demo hardware that's plugged into the CAN bus of the vehicle. And so like as these building blocks kind of like are built up alongside each other, it's going to become very difficult to, not impossible. It's never impossible, but it will become prohibitively expensive to try to send fake data in, and people inevitably will figure it out. But as long as we kind of sandbox it and design it in the right way, the damage will be relatively limited. And you can also do really cool things like allow people to mint their trip as an NFT once you can verify that they actually did that trip, and you can add data onto it. And that's something that we're building into the platform. And so there's like kind of a fun side and then the serious economic side as well.
And one last question, I'm gonna rip it from the audience, but I think it's actually a good way to wrap this up is, in the context of data sharing, one thing that comes up a fair bit is privacy, ensuring that, the data that's being provided for things like research and development isn't also being used to, misalign pricing for users on their insurance policy, right, for their car. How do you view sort of the lens of, blockchains by default are ultimately transparent and auditable, yet you want to ensure that users don't have these sort of negative externalities as a function of sharing their data. So like, what are some ways in which you're thinking about this or working to solve it? Obviously in the early stages of development, but it'd be good to get your thoughts on it.
Yeah. So this is something obviously we're asked about all the time, and we are doing what we're doing because we were very unhappy. One of the main reasons is we were very unhappy with the automotive industry's existing answer to it, and we think as a result of just kind of the incentives that are in front of them. It's not like there's bad people in the automotive industry that are trying to steal all of your data, but ultimately what we what the approach that we take is there's obviously some data that, in order to mint a road trip as an NFT, you need to have some data that lives on chain. And a big part of that is data that, basically already lives, not on chain, but in the public domain, which is, the VIN number of the car, the license plate of the car. There's all these existing like nice sort of identity primitives that we can bootstrap on and mirror their, real world accessibility in our sort of blockchain ecosystem or Web3 ecosystem we're creating. And so we try to draw the comparison one for one. Like the VIN number is technically personally identifiable information, and so we don't provide it like with the vehicle, but you can look up and see, for example, if someone's vehicle has been minted, and you don't attach all of the telematics data from that vehicle directly and put it on chain. That would be prohibitively expensive, but we certainly do make it possible for a user to, quote unquote, run their own node and not use any of our cloud infrastructure. You can, plug the device directly into your vehicle, store the data on the app locally, send it to your own IPFS node, and it's basically opt-in for everything in a granular way. And there's some really nice stuff that's coming out now as far as like how you do key rotation in a decentralized way, how you manage a lot of this data at scale that is really just like coming out. And so we feel like it's going to be a fascinating couple of years as far as how people are able to create these data assets that are generated in an ongoing way in a totally decentralized manner. Like Streamer is going to be our PubSub, like peer-to-peer data streaming partner in launching, and we already are streaming data over their network today from vehicles. And so there's all these nice pieces that are being created. And I think it's going to allow for a situation in which users are able to opt in and see exactly what they're sharing. And then also there's these nice economic incentives where people that are purchasing and using the data, whether it's for their own enterprise use cases or in an app, they're being forced to stake demo tokens. And those tokens will go up in amount. You'll have to stake more of these tokens and buy more of them to get access to the data as the amount of personally identifiable information in them goes up. And there's a whole process we're creating around basically taking the terms and conditions of data sharing agreements and putting it into a smart contract that says if your data is leaked in a hack or somebody violates the terms and conditions, their tokens will be slashed and distributed to the users that were impacted. And so there's kind of this like immediate compensation mechanism built in where once you start sharing your data with somebody, it can be used against you. There's no doubt about that. People know that from all of the hacks that have happened in the last 5-10 years, but at least we'll be able to bake in, kind of a dispute resolution and compensation mechanism that keeps it out of courts and allows people to feel whole about it. So yeah, that's something we're thinking quite a bit about, and we're going to take baby steps. Like it's not, it's not something that we're going to rush into. We're really focused on building supply, but it's there's a lot of interesting stuff happening that will help us do some unfair things compared to what you might get out of Amazon Cloud or Azure.
Totally. And it'd be interesting to see, find me an existing corporation that would append some type of insurance to their data management policy should it be leaked. It's an interesting world that we're sort of starting to step into. I want to thank you so much for joining us and appreciate you sharing more. And if anyone would like to have your ear talked off about all things mobility, open data networks, and everything in between, please feel free to reach out to Andy. So thanks, Andy, for joining us. And I think now we're going to turn to a brief break, if I've been informed properly, or we can roll into the next one. Sam, I don't know how you.
Yeah, let's do a brief break. But I think also people have been piling up some questions, or maybe have some asking. So let's call it a break. As planned for, I think it's 10 minutes. Is that right? Actually,
5 or 10 minutes.
All right, yeah, 5-minute break. I love it. Yeah, look at that. You get a 5-minute break. Okay, it's a 5-minute break if you want to go do a bio break or get a coffee. But if you have questions to pepper in, why don't you stay up, Clay, and you and I can bullshit if anyone has questions they want to pop in, and we can answer whatever limited knowledge we have. We probably shouldn't answer the ones specifically about other companies. But if people have broad questions they want to ask or points they want to make, chuck them in, or just go get a coffee. How you doing, Clay?
Good. I think it's interesting, just coming off of that panel, the concept of slashing. Should you be a bad actor, either in terms of data sharing or in terms of leaking specific data. So it incentivizes OEMs to operate in the right manner. It incentivizes users to share credibly, and so that piece of it, especially when you take sort of the broader network security piece associated with things like proof of stake. I don't know. It's an interesting application. So I was glad that Andy shared that.
Yeah, totally. What's while we're waiting, and if no one else puts anything in there, I'm kind of curious. How's Solana conference in Europe?
It's great. I mean, I think that it's interesting being on the ground and actually meeting developers that are building, with the underlying chain, and that it's very diverse in terms of, crypto has a million different entry points, as even this conference kind of has displayed. But to see sort of how the architecture around Rust as a programming language, as opposed to something like Solidity in the context of Ethereum, does have some merit in terms of its ability to bring folks from Web 2 and easily have them building on chain from day one. And so that's been great to see. I think that much like anywhere in crypto, there's a lot of activations around NFTs and things like that. And so that's no different, no matter what ecosystem you're in and around. But I think the thing that's resonated with me is just how accessible Solana has been from a developer perspective, at least in the conversations that I've had.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's turtles all the way down, right? But it is interesting that if you think about the biggest picture here, it's well, what is crypto doing? It's making effectively bootstrapping new economies accessible, right? From scratch, zero, rapidly scaling them, financial tools, et cetera. And then you think about even the tools or versions or flavors of crypto. I think it's coming from a Web 2 boomer perspective, as I do. It's I'm totally embracing that, by the way. It isn't, there are things about Web3 and where we're going that are different, and there are things that are not, right? And speed and accessibility will continue to be kind of key determinants of success. But cool. With that said, Will Quist, can you take over?
Yeah, sure.
Excellent. I think we'll dive back in, since there was one question.
Great to see Clay alive and doing well. I was worried about the Good Morning Army coming after him.
All right. Well, why don't you introduce the next panel and we can kind of go from there.
Sure.
Yeah.
Louise,
But
do you want to turn
Louise,
on your
is Louise up? There's Louise. We got Louise. Thanks for joining, Louise.
There she is. Fantastic. Hi, Louise. How are ya? Can we hear you? Uh-oh. Do we have audio? Are we hearing her yet? Uh-oh. She can hear me. That's exciting. Let's make sure we get her. It's gonna be much more interesting if everyone can hear you. I only have.
Oh, there you go.
There you go. Are you there?
No, not there.
Oh, strike two. Oh, I think that's her. Louise?
There.
Can you hear me if I don't take the...
Yeah, I can hear you. I can hear you. There we go. Fantastic. How are you?
I'm good. Very happy to be here. Sorry.
Yeah, thanks for being here. I'm excited about this one. It's kind of made me really think and turn my brain on. So why don't we just quickly get into, no one needs, I work with Sam at Slow. That's uninteresting. Louise, why don't you kind of give your background, where are you working now? And so everybody at least has some context, and then I'll jump in with a few of the questions I have personally, and hopefully they kind of overlap with other people's areas of interest.
Okay. Well, I'm Louise. I'm a researcher in Curve Labs, which is a Web3 company working in a lot of different projects. I'm involved mostly on the environmental side of crypto. So I work currently on different projects involving blue carbon and seagrass beds in the Mediterranean. And I try to design Web3 system in order to regenerate and protect them. And next to that, I wrote an article recently.
I was gonna mention that you kind of put yourself on the radar with a really well thought out article that I'm sure Caroline or someone can link to in the comments so everyone has it. But yeah, why don't you touch on?
I'm going to jump in for half a second, then I'll go away, I promise. But I think this is like, I think traditional Slow Ventures playbook, which is we come up with an interesting thesis we think is interesting and start courting people on it. And then we find people like Louise who have done 100 times more work and have better perspective than we do when we get to meet them.
Yeah, so why don't you give the quick 30 seconds on your piece, because it was fantastic and I think kind of pioneering in the space of what you tried to cover high level and kind of what your goal was. And then I think I'm ready to press on you some interesting questions, or at least interesting to me.
Yeah, this article, I thought before writing it, nobody has yet really do a mapping of all the existing Web3 environmental projects that were existing. And I thought that was needed. So I make some researchers about who is using Web3 tools for environmental purposes and why are they doing it. I reached out to a lot of companies and came up with this article that presents, so I missed a lot of them that I noticed later.
I'll teach you that that's another trick we've learned at Slow. The best way to find out about everyone is to publish a market map that's wrong.
Exactly.
Because everybody can't wait to tell you why you missed them and give you their point of view.
Exactly. A lot of people reach out to me saying, oh, you forgot, and you forgot us, and so, and yeah. But I think this is still quite representative of what's happening right now in the environmental scene. And so I made four categories to make it easier visually. And the main groups that are coming up are the carbon markets, the energy markets, groups and coalitions, and protection and regeneration. So these are like the four main areas where Web3 is engaging with the environment.
And I think you did a good piece that almost every Web3 piece should, at least as it's addressing non-crypto native sectors, on kind of touching on the inherent characteristics, openness, trustless, permissionless, et cetera. How in your mind does that kind of change how capital comes together to make a real difference over, I spend a lot of time thinking about, okay, we have existing systems trying to solve problems. How do we bring Web3, right, to create more effective solutions? How do you think about how those three inherent characteristics change what's possible? Or is it about recreating old models more efficiently?
You mean like how Web3 can help solve environmental problems?
Yeah, but because it's open, trustless, permissionless, is there anything inherent to Web3 that you think makes it easier to solve problems more effectively?
Well, crypto has, blockchain tools can help on two main sides, if I can say so. The first one is to know about, to help about provenance and tracking of resources, which allows the management and the allocation of resources that is particularly helpful for the carbon market and the energy market. But on the other side, crypto is also very useful to create new form of ownership and governance. And this is maybe more where the environmental protection and regeneration side is involved. And this is also the reason why it's also the one that has the less achieved right now, because it's more complex to construct new form of ownership and governance.
Yeah, I mean, as I read your piece, my output was that DAOs are really the revolution, at least when it comes to regenerative economics, that DAOs really become the revolutionary part of Web3. Am I reading your piece wrong? Is there more to it, or is DAOs a lot of where you expect to see blockchain bringing real change to the environment, or at least in the regenerative economics side of things?
Yeah, DAOs are a unique opportunity to tackle the climate crisis. Right now, there is almost 200 nations that are debating the future of the entire planet in Glasgow. But we all know that unfortunately, this conference, like all the others, is unlikely to result in much more than vague promises that cannot be fulfilled. But what DAOs offer as new governance model, they are more resilient, more transparent, more democratic than any existing governance models. They allow the population to emancipate themselves from centralized and strained traditional institutions in order to concretize what were previously distant theoretical concepts like adaptive governance. DAOs are also nice for this type of programs because they are borderless, and this is perfect to address such an issue. And all of that without wasting resources. One thing that DAOs should remember, though, is to onboard climate or environmental scientists and experts on their journeys, which is maybe not the case right now. Yeah, on this subject, I highly recommend taking a look at the Collectivo framework, which is one of the projects I'm involved in. It's going to be built on Celo. And what we created is it's called a DEX, that's a decentralized exchange trading system. And it's a mix between a DAO and a LETS, offering a new mode of adaptive and resilience governance of a community currency. And we also have data tokens supporting the ecological state of surrounding ecosystems. The first pilot is going to be developed on the island of Curacao in the Caribbean, and it's a great concrete example of how DAOs can revolutionize and empower modest nations in the fight for climate change.
And can you talk about Terra Zero real quickly too? Because that one jumped out to me as like a really interesting. I mean, it kind of gets into the quick conversation I want to have on: are we just reinventing the charity model, or are there actual different economic models to drive change? And I read quickly about Terra Zero, and that seemed to jump out to me as something that moves beyond charity and kind of creates a sustainable closed loop, a DAO that's out there creating sustainable economics in a flywheel fashion. So can you just kind of give people a sense of Terra Zero and how that may apply to other areas?
Yeah, Terra Zero is one of my favorite projects. It's very, very cool. It has been actually created by artists in Berlin. So it was an art project in the beginning and went way beyond that now. But the goal of Terra Zero is to create an autonomous forest using smart contracts. So what they've been doing, it's not built yet. I think they've done some tests and so, but not really built. But the project is to create the smart contracts for the forest that says to human, okay, now if you want to buy some of my lumber, you will have to pay the smart contract. And doing so, the forest can create its own treasury and manage its own treasuries using drones or IoT. You can report the state of the forest. And let's say the forest is doing good, then it can use its own money to buy more land and expand.
So cool.
it's super cool. And if it's doing bad, then it can pay humans in order to regenerate itself. And then like the forest exists as an economic entity on its own.
And is there any reason you couldn't? I know the other thing you talk on is that kind of subsystems in the marine environment are not nearly as addressed as carbon-based, I mean, kind of big carbon-based energy markets. I mean, is there any reason that can apply to other parts of the ecosystem, the Terra Zero model?
You mean to the energy system?
I mean, could we bring it? Could you bring it into the aquacultures? I mean, is that model's fascinating to me? The fact that the ecosystem has its own treasury and roots capital logically, right, for sustainable purposes. Is that unique to forests? Is that unique to this setup, or is that actually a more universal paradigm we can think about applying?
No, it's unique, but we are working on applying a comparative system on what we're working on in Collectivo, notably, but also me on my work with Posidonia oceanica, so the seagrass in the Mediterranean. We try to, so we have these bold ideas of biomimetic markets, where we try to construct the system or the economy around mimetics that are inspired by the nature. So, for example, setting a cap that would say, okay, we regenerate the seagrass beds until a certain threshold, and when this threshold is done, like we have enough fundings, then other fundings can be created, like seeds, and like what would happen in nature, other seagrass, other species of seagrass are impacted by these funds and can also proliferate because of that. So these are ideas that we try to play with, but again, this is all very theoretical and conceptual for now. And these are like because of legal structures and legal frameworks, these are the hardest Web3 ideas and concepts to put in place, I think.
This may get to a little bit, I know you've talked with Sam and Caroline in the past about kind of needing to get beyond a current conception of economic success, right? Like that there's a different, you kind of have to re-embrace, if not economics, at least economic success. I mean, does that biomimetic market, is that kind of what you're talking about when you think about different kinds of economically successful outcomes? Can you touch on that, kind of what you mean and where it needs to transition to really, and what role crypto plays in kind of reshaping the model so that it's aligned with positive change?
Yeah, nowadays, economic success centers on outdated tools, such as GDP. So what GDP says is basically the more you demand, the more you consume, the more you give the nation a chance to prosper. And that's obviously problematic. There is this book by Kate Warroth, Downward Economics, where she dismantles all the economic misconception, like Homo economicus, the Kuznets curve, and so on. And we don't really need to be expert in economics to quickly identify the flaws in this type of tools. The most obvious, according to me, are the depletion of natural resources and the irreversible damages that we do to the environment. And Web3 is an interesting tool to answer this type of problems because it allows a radical change of viewpoint and narrative. Cryptocurrencies, which are just like programmable money, they are a way to get out of the hellish debt and inflation cycle that fiat money has been plunged into. Smart contracts, they offer an exceptional opportunity to redesign our system by attributing them all the qualities that our economic system have now lacked: transparency, inclusiveness, resilience, governability, and so on. But what is also wonderful with the Web3 sphere is that everything is accessible, open source. And finally, it allows people like us who are aware about climate emergency to develop more secure, more inclusive and fair solutions, which is a privilege that until now was reserved and imposed by elites. So
what role does the charity model play going forward? I mean, now that we are talking about new ways to measure economic success, new ways to align people economically, what role do you think the charity model has going forward, right? And Does charity, is it about embracing does Web3 change charity? Does charity lose importance? What's your take on that?
Charity has the advantage to be very easy to be put in place, and it's also quick to put in place. For example, let me take the example of Collectivo, the project we're doing right now. So we're working on how to tokenize the ecological state of the food forest, but to acquire the terrain where we build the food forest, we issued NFTs, and some donators bought the food forest terrain and made it and allowed us to work on it. So the basic system that we had was also the charity model, because it was a quick and easy way to raise funds. And these funds have been then used to think about something bigger and more systemic. But indeed, the charity model is what is mostly present even on the environmental sphere, so, because it's quick and easy. But I hope that people will use the funds in order to think about something that is more long-term and more inclusive.
Got it. We're coming up on the last 2 minutes here. I mean, is there any takeaway you kind of want to leave everybody with, given kind of, I don't know, you after surveying the landscape and coming to, I think, a take where we're going to erode the charity model in form of new ways to pull time, money, and people together to kind of align that with new economic successes. Is there a clear takeaway?
Maybe if I could end on something, I would end on the fact that right now there are some subject or domain that environmental crypto is still lacking. And here I mean oceanology, blue carbon, everything related to the maritime world, so seas and ocean, which are absolutely central players in the climate system. And right now, crypto hasn't at all been involved in this climate subjects. And I really hope that in the future, more tools and ideas are going to be developed around that.
Got it. Awesome. I think that takes us right up to it. I really appreciate it, Louise.
Thank you. Me too.
Yeah. Sam, you got any bridging comments?
No, but this was great, Louise. Thank you for doing the hard work of actually looking at the whole universe and coming up with what's actually happening. It's great to have the research and look forward to way more interesting stuff happening on the horizon.
Yeah.
We were
Thank
also very excited about DAOs, as Clay and Will tell you.
Thanks, Louise.
Okay, so with that, I think I'd love to invite up Ryan as our last speaker of the day to take it home in our mini conference. Hey, Ryan, what's up, man?
Hi.
You got like a haircut or something. No, you're looking very sharp.
Thank you.
Cool and very, very crisp. I usually like my camera, but I think yours is better. Got to upgrade. Anyway, so everyone who's on and joining, we have Ryan, who is a great addition to this group, because I'll put it this way, which is I'd say Ryan is more knowledgeable about climate than basically all of us. But probably a lot less knowledge about crypto.
That is fair. Well, a holder, but definitely not as knowledgeable as this crew here. So I'm loving this conversation, Sam.
I think I really wanted to have Ryan join, and I really appreciate you taking the time, because you spend so much time on kind of what I call the more traditional ends of climate. Kind of from a focus area. You and John Doerr work obviously very closely together on this, working through normal government channels and kind of the brass tacks of policy and things like that. And I just wanted to get into with you and kind of talk about, again, you guys have a new book that just came out as well, on this very topic and what we have to do right now. So I'm kind of curious. I mean, I guess started off as like, scoping out, on the climate direction, not the crypto direction. Can you start out by just giving us your let's pause the crypto conversation for 1 second and give us a sense of what the hell's happening and what has to happen now? Please summarize your book for us in a few minutes.
I absolutely will. I mean, Sam, the traditional part is just focusing on the emissions themselves, right? So the book is called Speed and Scale. It comes out tomorrow, and we're incredibly excited for it, because it started out with the conversation with John about how do you apply OKRs to the climate crisis, right? Like that was the question we asked ourselves 2 years ago. How do you do that? And first, you go to where the gigatons are, right? Where do the 59 gigatons of emissions come from? How do you unpack it? What are the sources? And then truly, could you set some objectives to draw those down, right? Going from 0 to 250, and then, 59 to 0. And then how do you get there quicker, right? Because there is this belief that we will get to net zero someday, like 2070, 2090. But the reality is we've got to get there much, much faster. To kind of set the scene, the developed world, i.e. the US, Europe, and China have been emitting for quite some time. We've put a lot of CO2, methane, and other gases into the atmosphere. Because of that, it's a little bit warmer than it used to be. The IPCC, which is the UN Interplanetary Climate, there's climate convention in the IPCC name, put out a report that sort of finally put a carbon budget, Sam, on how many gigatons left that we can emit. So we emit 59 a year, and they said in a nice little chart with sensitivities, if we cross 400 more tons emitted, global warming of that 1.5 degrees, we're going to kind of walk past it, right? We get to the 500, it's pretty certain. You get to 600, well, 700, you start to get to the 1.5 plus 2 degree range. Why does that matter? Well, that's just an average, right? 1.5 degree warming doesn't feel bad to you and I, but that means it's like 10 degree warming in the poles. Bad, right? Melting things. But 1.5 degree warming around the equator is bad too, because it warms up oceans and things like that. But this conversation really isn't about the problem of the climate crisis, because I think everyone on this topic cares about it. What we want to kind of just quickly show off is the things we have to do. And this poster, by the way,
you really come with your graphics. I love it.
I do. Captures the things we got to do, right? We got to electrify transportation. We got to decarbonize the grid. We've got to fix food, protect nature, i.e. end deforestation. So the conversation earlier about that, I found quite fascinating. We've got to clean up industry. Steel and concrete are still really hard. They emit a bunch. And then at the end of the day, no matter what model you look at, there's still going to be emissions that we emit, and we got to find ways to remove them using nature and engineering methods. And then remember those accelerants I talked about? There are 4 equal ones. These are all on the same pedestal. You got to win the policy and politics. You got to turn movements into action from the ballot box as well as into the corporate boardroom. We've got to innovate. And honestly, innovation is truly like the success of it is like the cost of these green things, right? No one's going to pick the fancy green thing if it's expensive. We got to find a ways to drive that down. And then we've got to invest a ton. And then for all the OKR lovers, each one of these has a set of KRs to them. I think that's—
So who's responsible for those OKRs? They all need an owner.
Yeah, they all need an owner. And so the kind of beautiful thing is on different parts, like for electrified transportation, you've got Ryan Popple, who is the CEO of Proterra, right? The electric bus company, who's like, I'm going to make sure that every bus sold is electric. Right? Or you got Elon, or like pushing the electric car industry forward. You've got Lynn Jurek of Sunrun saying, we're going to electrify and decarbonize the grid by adding solar. So yeah, there's a ton of different owners. And John really well, Sam. I think he's got this charge for 2022 to say, once this comes out there, can we find out who's working on these and how do we lift those people up?
So I want to dive in there. One of the comments I think a few people have made in the comment threads is just like, I'm very, very, very skeptical / negative on like government carbon marketplaces and trading. Am I right to be?
I think you are. I mean, because a lot of these carbon markets that exist, I mean, there are different categories of them, but let's just talk about offsets for a second. There are so many different quality of offsets. Right? Like the best offset is you being able to verify that carbon has been removed and it's sequestered somewhere. And you know what? Nature does a pretty good job of that. And so the book really celebrates nature-based removal, about like restoring forests, protecting them, kelp regeneration, because they're really good at doing that. But we also need the carbon removal technologies like Climeworks and Charm and others that are truly pulling carbon from the sky and then pumping it down into the ground. These offset programs need to be tied to those high quality carbon removals, not the like ones that are like, hey, Sam, I'm going to pay you not to emit and I'm going to go emit over here. Or that's kind of.
So when you talk about these like big ass, technology, like here's my question, and this kind of bridges into the crypto space a little bit, but just to understand, which is like, one of the beautiful things about crypto, right, is you basically get almost like an economy in a box with financial speculation in a box. So some people see it as scary, but what that really means is you can add a huge amount of fuel to fire very quickly. Like if you need $1 trillion tomorrow, especially watching what's gone on in Washington, in my head, I'm like, I think it might be easier to get it from crypto markets than from like governments, right? Is your, like, talk to me a little about how these things are financed, and is there a world in which a lot of the most ambitious projects actually need to be financed by crypto solutions versus governments?
This is so maybe I'll point us toward the objective. The objective here is to reduce the green premium, right? Bill Gates coined the term. What it means is it's the added cost of the cleaner, greener alternative. That cost can be driven down, right? Solar and wind finally in these past 2 years went from a green premium to a discount. And what's kind of neat is when it becomes a discount, money just flows, right? Like that's the reason why you're seeing the billions and trillions being talked about going, yeah, let's put it behind solar and wind. It's because financially it makes sense. But for all the other technologies, like really good carbon removal, a handful of green hydrogen projects, storage plus solar, these things are still expensive. And so I think a charge for this community to think about is, well, how do we find ways to accelerate the drive down of that cost? The Gates team has a program called Breakthrough Energy Catalyst, which is actually paying ahead for some of these things. So for sustainable air fuel, it's really hard to find and get. And the premium to it is almost double existing air fuel. And so if a whole bunch of people come together and say, well, we're going to buy sustainable air fuel, the price goes down because you're actually, one, buying it, the chicken and egg problem, but you're also solving a bunch of like logistical problems too. Like how do airports get it? How do they transport it? And so forth. And so kind of the charge I would put to the group here is a lot of these things are really expensive now. There are tax proposals that make things a little bit cheaper, but are there other ways too, like philanthropic dollars? Are there ways the crypto community can create things around them to just put more dollars behind things to really lower that curve?
Well, and let me ask you this question though, which is like, look, I mean, I get the traditional perspective on this stuff. And the traditional perspective is it needs to be cheaper. And once it's cheaper, then like it becomes obvious. And in the meantime, we can kind of subsidize things with governments just writing checks and printing more money, right? Being in kind of a crypto community and like kind of angle, I think the question in my mind is, does it actually have to be cheaper? Right? Do we actually, or can it just be more expensive, but we just choose it and like we basically build markets around it anyway? And like effectively, when you think like, and how do we change the narrative around this? Like, well, it has to be cheaper to work, because that in some ways is trying to retrofit a different economy. If we go back to what Sepp was talking about, to just seamlessly fit like there's nothing there, right, into our existing economy, versus saying no, like the magic power here is to build new economies as we want, right? As long as they balance economically, rationally to the wants and interests of the actors in the system.
So totally, it doesn't have to be. You're right. I think the obsession on the cost piece is that once it becomes cheaper and performs better, the money will flow. But you look at what Stripe has done, what Microsoft has done to create a market around carbon removal. The amount of money that the two companies have put into play is very tiny in the grand scheme of things. I think there was a comment kind of coming into the chat around like how much carbon removal actually capacity is out there. Like Climeworks, their facility does maybe some 4,000 tons a year, the one that just went online. The team at Charm keeps putting thousands of tons in the ground. We need to get to billions of tons, but companies like Stripe, companies like Microsoft are paying that premium, right? The $600 a ton of carbon removal and saying it's worth it to us. We think it's valuable. And the more folks that do that, the wheels start moving, and then hopefully that 600, the KR, Sam, around this is by 2030, that $600 should be 100. If you get it to 100, really cool things can happen. You get it to 50 by like 2040 and 50 and beyond. Like,
sorry, get it to 40, 50, and then what happens at 40, 50?
Oh, well, if in 2040 and 50, if the price of carbon removal can be $50 or less, the whole concept of like a carbon tax, right? A pollution fee, like actually can be executed upon, right? Like someone collects it and then someone pays for the removal. And at $50, that's really, I would say really affordable, right? Like it actually, yeah.
Fair enough. So I guess the other question I have here, because again, like I think the other really interesting thing we face is this is a global tragedy, the commons. I can't think of a problem. There's been a lot of tragedies of the commons in history, but this is the first one I can think of that truly is practical and deeply global, right? And you can talk about the emissions of the first world countries. That's actually not the problem, right? Big picture, right? The real problem is the developing world and the tension where the developing world says, hey, you guys got to pollute for centuries on your way up the curve. We didn't. How dare you now put the kibosh on us doing this when we need it and you're sitting pretty, right? And so my question is like, when you think about this stuff and the geopolitics of it, and again, I think about global coordination, again, I'm very excited about the abstract pieces, which is, man, like crypto is the fastest growing global phenomenon of coordinating people across nations, across everything. You know, do you think our politicians have enough of a grip on this stuff, or do you think, or is it just going to be think like, how is this going to actually like, or do you need a different economic model? Like, I mean, I guess maybe a simpler way to put my question is, how optimistic are you that our political systems can actually get any of this done, right? Versus needing something new.
A few things to throw out and react. It's the world is warmer today because of the US and Europe, right? Like there's no question about that. And then, when folks point fingers at, India and China, well, maybe India, let's actually talk about India for a sec, right? They are 13% of the world's population, only 5% of the emissions. They're trying to, revamp their grids. They're trying to get their, the curve to go up in GDP. And the takeaway is this, is as the United States, right, at least being, as that's where I live and come from, we've got to be first, Sam. We've got to be the first to decarbonize. We've got to set the pace. And it's a selfish reason, by the way. The selfish reason here is that there is a humongous economic opportunity behind investing in these companies, being part of that revolution. Also, if we can show it can be done, like other countries will follow. Our message to the developing world, right? Countries like India, and then, you have the continent of Africa, they have a choice to make. We can't tell them, hey, stop burning, gas or coal when there's no really strong alternative, right? And so the message to them is, hey, when you think about picking those things, realize there are cleaner, cheaper things. Like don't put in the ground an investment that's going to be a lost asset to you in 5 to 10 years. And because if you do, you'll make the same mistake we did in the West, like put solar, put wind, yes, install a gas peaker because you're going to need it for the time being, but have a phase out plan for it. You asked about the economic model. I think we're kind of sort of like pressing on all cylinders here to like fit in the model that exists today. But I think what some countries don't realize is this transition is happening now. And when it happens, it's going to hit companies and countries really hard. Like you look at Shell and Exxon, rewind 7 years ago, their profits were gloriously high and they did nothing of value with them, right? They still stuck to being an oil and gas company. You have Ørsted in the Danish region. They were put under some cost pressures and said, well, shoot, we can't compete with the US natural gas anymore. What do we do next? So they went to the seas, right? Their same offshore oil rig work. They said, well, we're going to put up wind farms and we're going to be competitive there. And then, now fast forward 4 years later, they dropped the cost by 60%. They're worth over $50 billion. They're leading that wave, and Shell and Exxon are like, wait a second here. I mean, honestly, most of these companies have to think of themselves as really put themselves in the shoes of their customers. Like people are going to give up oil. Shell and Exxon should probably start making batteries. They should start figuring out new clean, like they've got a lead on this, but Sam, they don't got the money that they used to on it. And you're kind of seeing that in their stock price as well. There is one message I think worth like discussing here as a community, right? Our charge in the book really is to point to the gigatons. And if you like, I would love to see, I think there's a lot of work probably around this, but it's like we as a community use a lot of energy. There's no way around it. And I think we've got to find a way to transition from the emitting sources of energy to the ones that are cleaner. Let's say we were a bunch, at an AI conference, right? We could say the same thing there, like our data centers keep getting bigger and so forth. And, but we have an easy solution in that world, right? Because we own the data centers, we can make them clean very easily. I don't think we have that same luxury here, right? Like because of the decentralized nature, we don't quite control where the work happens. And like, I don't have the answer here, but I am putting the charge to the group, right? It's that we emit a lot. Like if the numbers are true, it's like what, 91 to 110 terawatt hours per year. That's all of Malaysia and Sweden. That is true emissions. Sure, some of it's clean, but like you almost need like Bitcoin's, sorry, for each kind of asset. It's like, what is the makeup of energy that powers it? And then what is our solution as a community to moving it forward? Because that same exercise is happening in the physical world, but I guarantee it can happen faster here. We're saying, hey, we've got a whole fleet of cars that take 14 years to turn over. How do we move them electric? It's like, these are the kind of things that.
Yeah, well, here's the interesting thing about that, Ryan. You and I talked a little about this offline. It's like, look, there's two parts to this story, I think, in terms of like the crypto community's like first party cleanliness. The first is obviously that like most of the modern like Web3, infrastructure players, right, are not going to be proof of work based things. They're already not. Yeah. Like the Solanas of the world, which is obviously, a slow seed investment that's done very well. There's Chia, Bram Cohen's company, that's also a slow investment that's doing incredible work on the climate space, et cetera. So I think there's like partially like it's one of those things where like, honestly, this is a proof of work chain problem, not a crypto problem, right? And then the question is, well, the specific type of proof of work, which requires hashing power, is that good or bad? Now, the good news about it is it's by far the most secure, right? So you think about the spectrum of security and the point of Web3. I do think that if you're going to spend energy on something, securing the decentralized world is right up there with, I think, good uses of energy, right? The last thing I'll kind of note on this, and then happy to, we can take in any direction, is like, there's a very big difference between crypto and Bitcoin, let's say in cars, right? And here's the difference. The difference is that in the car analogy, the good is driving a mile, right? And therefore, like, you can go for the cheapest mile driven and you're done, right? And so yes, you can choose to pay a little more for while you're done. Here's the interesting thing about Bitcoin. It's not actually secured by energy. It's secured by money, right? And so actually Bitcoin, if energy were more expensive, that's ironically very good for Bitcoin, not bad for Bitcoin, right? Because the whole point, right, is to make it expensive in real terms, proxied through energy, right, to mine, to secure the chain. So interestingly, again, I think, the crypto native, or at least my crypto take on this would be, well, I agree with you, and I think there's a lot being done to make crypto greener and Bitcoin greener, and there's a lot of the, just as you say with Exxon and Mobil, like the smart people are investing ahead, right, into green technology for their mining operations for purely economic reasons, so I think that is happening anyway very rapidly. There is this other bogey, which is if globally, coal was banned, nothing would be better for crypto, right? Like actually nothing will be better for it. It's actually just a problem of, in some ways, crypto will be, because of its nature and the conversion of energy into money, right? And vice versa, as such a pure proxy. In some ways, I think Bitcoin will be, in some ways, a great test of how green the global world really is getting, right? Because it will always seek out the cheapest energy, right? That's available. And it's the cheapest, and that's kind of the way I would think about it, is actually the smartest people will invest ahead, but you might be right that the last coal-fired plant that powers down will be mining Bitcoin so long as it's cheapest. But that's actually, I think, the back test, not anything more than that, right? Because I think the majority of it won't be. And like, that's actually the interesting thing, right?
I can't disagree with anything you said, because it's true. Like, will the last coal-fired plant be a crypto plant or Bitcoin plant, right? And if the answer is yes, that's like something that we have to figure out how to stop, right? Because like, we can't be the reason the transition gets dragged.
But it won't be. I think you should think about it as a test, right? Which is that if the system's working, right, like that's the back test, right? And remember that like the more expensive energy is, purely, the better it is for Bitcoin, right? Like in general, which I think is like a very counterintuitive thing for people to get their heads around, because everything else in our world, you want energy to be cheap.
The one thing I think the hard part about this is you can't police the source of energy, or maybe there is a way to do that, but because you can't, I know I was sharing this, like, it's a poor analogy, but it is an analogy worth thinking about, right? It's like, is proof of work to oil like proof of stake to like solar and wind, or is Bitcoin to oil like Solana is to solar and wind? Right? Like, that's something that I just think, like, we just have to look at ourselves in a mirror. Like, the same time we're looking at like the value of our accounts and saying, how do we make this transition a lot faster and quicker because we are consuming energy. And if we as a community are like, hey, we'll set goals in 2040, 50 and beyond, that's the same timelines that the oil companies are setting, right? Like we should be in the 2030 category, the 2025 category.
Ironically, I think the way to address that, just riffing you for a second, is actually a security question, not an energy question, right? Because the reality is, in the end of the day, the reason that Bitcoin, and I'm a big believer in Bitcoin long term, right, will, I believe, be digital gold over the long term. It'll be a very important asset, regardless of what happens in the smart contracting space and a lot of the evolutions from it, is because it's the most secure, right? By a lot, right? And so the question is, like, if to use your analogy, it's like if coal mining or coal-fired plants had a dramatically more security, right, than solar, right? Then the question is, you got to get solar, which would be the other chain equivalents, to be on par or superior, right, in terms of their distribution, in terms of their security, et cetera, to ever think about kind of moving off. Now, I don't think that'll actually have to happen, because I think the reality is what will actually happen, right, is most Bitcoin mining is going green very quickly for purely economic reasons. The same thing Shell, right, should have gone green, right? People are a little smarter in this community, right, in terms of where things are going. And then I think, look, I mean, to the extent that governments are able to do what they need to do and really kind of move to these sources, Bitcoin will be nothing but benefiting from that, from my personal perspective.
Quick question for you, Sam. If you could write any pull request to the two largest, Bitcoin, Ethereum, right, the two largest market cap currencies, what would you have to change to make it less carbon intense by 2025, like, or even in the next year or two? Like, what magic wand could you wave to just dial down the intensity? Because security, you're right, is the reason why the energy piece exists. But
yeah, I mean, I think that the answer would be, and this is I'd have to think more about this. I think it's a good question. It'd be something along the lines of, like, it should be somehow transparent in the chains where you're coming from, right? And that has its own challenges, and like also a little bit, I think if you had to in some way verifiable way stamp, right? Cool. And this is not a government, it would have to be fundamentally technological. It could not be like a mandate type thing, right? But stamp into the chain the source, that would be an interesting thing.
And the thing is, it's like, I mean, the way that it's currently framed, it's like you'd have to find a way that people can't lie about it, but that's the whole like essence.
That's not yeah. And the problem is, we should move on. But like, one, I'd say it is fundamentally against the premise of crypto, right? Of like proof of work chains, which is energy is energy is energy, right? Yeah. That's actually like the unit that is universal and useful, right? Which is why effectively it's not about currency, it's about basically taking all the world's economy and going to the base layer of energy, and then using that base layer of energy to secure a system. And that is such a fundamental breakthrough. I mean, candidly, if you said to me, you have a carbon budget, you have a carbon budget to spend as a world, right? What do you spend it on? I actually think that actually goes, and, do you trade that for air travel? I'm not sure, but you trade it for a lot, right? Because it is a pretty fundamentally good use. Anyway, not answerable questions, but always a good conversation.
Always.
Cool. Anything you want to add in closing? I appreciate you joining and giving us the other perspectives.
Oh, I loved being here. For folks that just, if climate is a new issue to you, like, check out speedandscale.com, grab the book. Like, it features 35 incredible stories of founders and policymakers and others who are fighting the fight. Because honestly, like, we're going to be putting out a revision of this book every year. And I would love to find a way to include a story from this community in next year's revision, right? Like how we are. Sam, you put out a solution there that could work, but so grab it if you're not new to climate. If you are deep in climate, I think you're going to pick it up and be like this stuff just pours more fuel to the good fire.
Excellent. Cool. Ryan, thank you.
Thank you.
Cool, everyone. So I'll close up again. We're maybe 2 minutes behind schedule, but not much more. I just want to thank everyone for joining. I learned a lot today. I appreciate kind of everyone kind of participating and sharing. We'll certainly post this out, and I think Caroline and I will follow up with some sort of way to get in touch and keep in touch through a listserv or a little group if you want to participate in it. But again, this is a really interesting discussion to me. And look, I love irony, is what I would say. And to me, there's a lot of FUD thrown around the crypto world about climate. I actually think nothing would make me happier than that it turns out, which I think is very credible, that it's actually one of the most important parts of the solution. And so it's great to be here with builders and thinkers, all thinking about how to make that reality. I do think all the great stories in life are deeply ironic, and it's great when the work that is happening in kind of one space, Web3, really you can talk about reaching back into the real world and having real impact. So with that, I'll close out. I'll just last say, Caroline, thank you for organizing this and making this all happen and get everything together. And we'll wave at Caroline. Thank you. Appreciate all the help. And we'll hopefully see all you guys soon, either digitally or physically or whatever. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.